Welcome to the Terminology Leading Practices stream of SNOMEDCT Expo 2024. Thank you to B2I for sponsoring this stream. My name is Nick Egerhaus, and I'm the Global Vendor Engagement Lead and Customer Relations Executive, Middle East, Africa, and North America at SNOMED International, and I'll be moderating today's session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Online attendees, please use the Q&A button to type your questions to the presenter. On-site attendees, please use the microphone provided in the room. I'm now pleased to introduce Brian Carlsen from Coast Informatics, who will be presenting automated mapping SNOMEDCT to ICD11. Brian, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you everybody. Do I get my slides up? Okay, so unfortunately Tim Williams was going to be here with me, but he was unable to stay for family reasons. So I'll be doing the talk. Hello, I'm Brian Carlsen from Coast Informatics, and here to talk today about a project we did recently with SNOMED to map all of the SNOMED clinical findings, events, and situations to ICD11, and this was a kind of follow-on to some earlier work that had partial coverage, and we did some things but not other things, and this was kind of an effort to say what's involved and what does it look like to actually do the whole thing, follow the coding guidance, so deal with the complicated situations, deal with extensions, so create the post-coordination, multiple SEM codes, multiple extensions for those of you familiar with ICD11, and even map advices in situations where it's called for the possible need for an extra code in various situations and things like that. I think these learning objectives are just some quick things that hopefully you'll take away from all of this. I'll let you just read them quickly, but I have a lot to get to. So this was, again, like I said, everything that's sort of clinical finding related, condition related in SNOMED to ICD11 MMS, so the linearization. A lot of people asked if we were doing work to the foundation, and since the linearization is sort of the parallel to ICD-10 and the thing that WHO does actually publish and would be the kind of corollary to SNOMED for public health reporting and so on. That was the target here. And essentially created a scope on the other side to map to leaf node things and then also include mappings to the extension codes. Just some like very brief statistics about the numbers of things that were involved. So we did a lot of work on this project in the beginning. So we took some time to kind of digest both SNOMED and ICD11 and pull out information about the parts that were relevant and do some sort of pre-mapping. So for example, a SNOMED condition may have a finding site or a morphology or a reference to an organism or a device or something like that. And a lot of this content is represented in ICD11 in the extension hierarchy. So sort of take those set of concepts in SNOMED and take the corresponding extension codes in ICD11 and actually map those first, so that then when we're deep in the process of coming up with the full map, we can add those in the appropriate place. Also kind of say there's chapters in ICD11. They align to some extent with sub-hierarchies in SNOMED. So, if we're talking about neoplasms, what would you call the kind of ECL expression to define where neoplasms live in SNOMED? And then we can use this information to say, are we finding an ICD11 code in the space where we would expect to, given where the SNOMED concept sits and that sort of thing. Did a lot of work to generate synonyms. There are areas where SNOMED and ICD11 talk about things differently, or there's varying levels of inconsistency, like caused by and due to and things like that. So just kind of took an approach to allow that stuff to be resolved. And then also ICD11 has a lot of conjunction terms, this thing or this thing or this thing, fracture of wrist or ankle or whatever. So unravel all of that into simpler terms for matching purposes. So, SNOMED doesn't really do that, but because of the categorization stuff, we need to unravel all of that. And then this was a project where, because it's 2024, we used AI for various things. And one of the key things is using vector embeddings to represent the kind of trained semantic meaning of strings that are involved. So effectively took all of the in-scope ICD11 codes and generated vectors for them and put them in an index, so that in addition to doing standard kinds of lexical searching that you would expect, we also do vector embedding searches, nearest neighbor kind of stuff, to find candidates, but then also to kind of score the results. This is a basic algorithm approach. So, step one is a kind of analyze the SNOMED concept. This says, look at the nature of the defining relationships, characterize it in various ways. Is this a kind of thing that's going to require a cause code? Is this something that likely doesn't actually have a map for various reasons, or other kinds of tags that we could put on it? Then essentially go into a phase where we find all the reasons why we might connect a SNOMED thing to an ICD11 thing. So it could be a lexical match, it could be an embedding match, it could be a kind of crosswalk through the SNOMED to ICD10 and then the ICD10 to ICD11 maps. And then also we kind of, by working with the SNOMED mapping team earlier in this project, came up with sort of sets of rules around areas of SNOMED that would have expected scope definitions in ICD11. They're kind of narrower than even the chapter or block levels, or situations where you just kind of always want to add a certain code for one reason or another. So we take sort of fruitful generation of connections, and in this case, the analyze phase also did an effort to try to identify situations where we would expect multiple codes. So, pneumonia due to HIV or due to AIDS is an example where you'd think to have two ICD11 codes for the two parts of it. So by looking at how SNOMED represented the content, we sort of generate a searchable thing that represented trying to find a single ICD11 code, and then a different searchable thing, or possibly multiple ones, where we try to find combinations of codes that would go together, and then match those things. So this generate phase is really looking for the multiple stem code situation and not really worrying about post-coordination until we have all of those things. And then it does actually add the post-coordination at the end. So for every SNOMED to ICD11 connection, find the things that are talked about on the SNOMED side that require post-coordination and add them back in. Then certain things come out of this that are invalid. This would be, for example, an infection, a staph infection, where the ICD11 code said streptococcus instead of staphylococcus, like that sort of thing, where because the embedding is nearness matching, you wind up with a lot of stuff that is really not appropriate. So then we could do a level of getting rid of things that we know aren't matches, and then fundamentally score each thing. And this is another sort of opportunity to use AI. So, one of the things that's really good about vectors is you can have this kind of document representations of things and sort of ask questions about how similar they are. So we could build a document representation of a SNOMED concept that says, this is a thing with these parents, and it has these relationships, and so on, like a kind of longer narrative about it. And then if you have a complicated map on the right-hand side that has multiple stem codes and extensions, you could sort of do a similar thing. And then this way you kind of take into account all of the, pointing things sort of where context gives you a slight edge to choose one set of things over another. Because sometimes the generate phase would generate hundreds of possible answers for a certain case. So you really want to kind of like factor that. Yeah, so we talked a few of these things. We did do, AI changed a lot over the course of this project, and we tried lots of different things along the way, and eventually settled on using Google Palm for the vectors. And then we also did some work with LLMs in the space of kind of canning prompts to send things in batch and answer questions about it. So for example, one thing we did was send in all the strings in the neoplasm chapter and say, what's the morphology that's talked about in the ICD11 thing, if it's talking about it at all. Then take that list and map it to a SNOMED code. So then we have this basis of saying, well, is the SNOMED concept and the ICD11 thing talking about compatible morphologies? ICD11 can be broader, so is it a descendant of that thing or not? And if it's not, then that's an opportunity to score it lower or filter it or something like that. We also use vectors, as I said, for matching, just to find things. And then some of this pre-mapping that we did, like the extension map, we use vectors to just kind of line everything and then quickly review it so we could get through that in order to use it for the other stuff. Okay. You still need an algorithm. And there's an awful lot of rules. There is coding guidance about how certain situations need to be dealt with in ICD11. And ECL is very useful in a lot of ways to kind of tune exactly what you're doing in specific situations where it's very important to kind of not lose track of the scope of where you're supposed to be operating. So a lot of work was put into these, and we're not talking about hundreds of rules. This is more like dozens of rules at the max. But you can use rules for narrowing the scope. You can use rules sometimes for choosing a target code. You can use rules also for filtering. And then we can also use the ECL that we came up with to map to the chapter and block levels to score answers that are in, that represent things that we have in the expected answer set for a SNOMED concept. So a SNOMED neoplasm should have a neoplasm code, for example. There's some complicated areas on the SNOMED side, multiple condition things. So, it's tricky for a lot of reasons because sometimes the multiple condition things are actually in ICD11 as single things, and sometimes they're not. And then there are certain situations that get complicated, like if influenza is being referenced, but it's actually not a condition as the second part of it, but it's actually the organism reference, you still want to code to influenza because this is for public health reporting. And if you wind up with not a code to influenza, but you wind up with a code to something else that has an extension of influenza virus, you're not really hitting the mark. Injury in healthcare is a particularly complicated area where this is something went wrong after a procedure or was in response to a device failure or because of a medication reaction. Adverse events fall under that. And there's this notion of a three-part rule where you have a code that represents the nature of the harm, a code that represents the cause, and the code that represents the mode of the harm. And so recognizing that it is one of these kinds of things and then taking a slightly different approach through the algorithm to find those parts, and it was part of what we did. Drug-related, drug-induced, really, that should say, is also another kind of special area where you treat it a little differently. And then there's some special rules around HIV and AIDS having to do with staging. Obstetrics is also a fairly complicated area, which is really kind of one of the weaknesses that's left, is we didn't really get super deep into getting all the obstetric content right. And then very general SNOMED concepts are hard. Either they don't map to anything or they map just sort of really vaguely. So a few examples. So injury in healthcare, right, has 3 codes. So you have to kind of take a string that represents one of these things and figure out which parts of it refer to the 3 parts that we're trying to go with. And this is another area of using vectors to kind of figure this out, because ICD11 has these sort of categories of classes of things. So for example, in a poisoning, it could be due to a medication or not a medication, like a non-medical substance. And then, even in the cause area, if it's an intentional poisoning, it could be an intentional poisoning of a particular class of drug, a psychostimulant or something like that, versus a different class. You got to do that work to actually figure out where the actual SNOMED substances live in these sort of class representations in ICD11. So this area is particularly complicated. Yep, so this is a related area. In this case, there's sort of 2 codes, but anyone who's worked with ICD-10 knows the poisonings and overdoses are just require an extra level of attention to get it right. And then here, there's a lot of attention paid to the extensions because we want to pick up the substances that are involved properly and all that sort of thing. Right, so the HIV thing is about specifying the clinical stage or not. So there's some sort of rules about that. And so what do you do when you don't have this information, and so on. We worked through a lot of this with the mapping team and kind of came up with a set of examples that represent it so we could see what it was supposed to look like and then see whether the algorithm was doing the right thing. And there's just some complicated things. I'm not going to get too into this one. But special rules around how to code the obstetric stuff. There's a lot of things that make this hard too that are just about the underlying stuff. So modeling is not always 100% consistent in SNOMED. So if you say, I'm going to depend upon there being a reference to a particular substance, then there's a lot of things that can go wrong. If there isn't that, or it's not the kind of thing that you think that it is, then you can wind up missing the nature of what the thing is because it looks different at this sort of technical level. Hierarchy things. So you can, I said we applied ECL to sort of identify where things sort of belong. But then that doesn't always work. There are, various situations where things wind up being kind of in a different place than you would expect when you've made certain decisions about things. And so, these are reasons why stuff can sometimes go awry if you're depending too much on those aspects. Yep, so, I think we maybe took a naive approach to some of this stuff too, and there are situations where, I mean, this is multiple causative agents, but you can also have, things that look like, a thing that has a cause, substance cause, but also looks like comes after a procedure. So there's, it's very hard to cleanly define everything in SNOMED as having one rule that goes with it. So you find these cases eventually where, there's potentially multiple different combinations of rules that apply, and then you have to, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, really, these are ones people should look at because it's ambiguous, like really what you should do in those situations. So ICD11 also, because of its nature, there's a lot of things. I mean, we talked about the conjunction stuff, that's hard. Post-coordination is tricky because the coding tool, and therefore the Docker image that you can download and run, does have some representation of the post-coordination prompting, but it's not always present. And there are situations where you want post-coordination, but it's not prompted for. And so you have to kind of decide where should you do that always versus where should you do that only in the context of it being explicitly suggested. And we don't have a whole lot of insight into why it's in certain areas and not in other areas. So kind of picked a rule about how to follow doing this and had some overrides, cases where we would just always post-coordinate. And then, of course, other and unspecified is still complicated. And this is in part because things like large language models don't know anything about what other means, because it is only meaningful in the context of a collection of other pieces of information that you would then also have to sort of send in order to. That said, there are additional approaches that we could take to improve on this area. And I think for anyone who reviews the content, you'll find that sometimes the first and second answer are an other and an unspecified thing, and possibly you would argue they should be in the other order. So there's a little bit of more work to be done on this area to just kind of get that right. And we have some ideas for that we just didn't quite get to. And then, of course, in the extension stuff, SNOMED has a model, ICD11 has a hierarchy, and ICD11 has a different one and has different content and names things differently sometimes. And so there isn't a perfect alignment between these things. And so to try to say we should use this code, and in this case, I think it's even just that things in ICD11 are sometimes unexpectedly not near each other when you think that they should be, and that sort of thing. So I'm sure there's a lot of this kind of stuff that there could be disagreement about, and exactly which things should be used in one situation or another. And then categories of things are just hard to deal with, because these categories, in this case, it's lower leg including ankle. So that's sort of like a broader thing, but in the endocrine chapters, there's stuff that represent like classes of molecules that are relevant for metabolism in certain ways. And the representation of those categories is not equivalent between SNOMED and ICD11. So those are things too where you have to rely on other mechanisms to see how to group those things together. And ultimately, again, human judgment is still needed, because there are just situations where it's not really reasonable to kind of pick something definitively. This chronic kidney is stage 3, there's stage 3A and stage 3B. So which is it? There's no stage 3. Yeah, so overall, I think it's pretty good. We really wanted to have a gold standard to kind of produce some numbers against, but it proved to be very challenging to do that, because the gold standard was sort of, we were evolving the guidance as we were working through it, and then we updated versions of the terminologies and then tried to remap things. And in the end, there was a lot of disagreement between the algorithm and the gold, but then looking at it, the algorithm was actually doing the right thing and the gold just needed to be fixed. And, we had sort of stopped working with the team at that point who was maintaining those maps. So changing versions of things makes, there's a bunch of stuff you have to recompute and then assess sort of like where all the things are different. And like I said earlier, the top answer is not always the best one. Sometimes it's the second one. But really the point of all of this is you're never going to have an algorithm that perfectly maps 129,000 concepts in every single case. But what you can do is have something that produces a few suggestions that are very high quality from which you can pick and tune them. And even further identify where it is doing a good enough job and there isn't ambiguity that requires human review. So you can get through this in a reasonable amount of effort. Yeah, and there's a lot to say about this. There may be a lot of questions, so also feel free to come by our booth if you have any questions that go unanswered in this session.
Thanks. Brian will now take questions. As a reminder, if you're in the room, please use the microphone, this microphone, to ask your question.
Hi, many thanks for a great presentation, Brian. I'm Peter from HL7 New Zealand, and I have a fire terminology server with a candidate implementation of ICD11 on it. So I'm interested, how much easier, if at all, would it have been if you'd used the foundation work, particularly the definition of the concept, the parent,
It's
child properties, the designations from the foundation? Because you can get it via a web service call. Directly from MMS, you've got the link and they'll give you the key, the API key to go and make a call to get that data.
This is from the Docker image that you can do this also? Or
No,
from their API?
I download the linearization MMS, put it up there, and it's got the URL link to get to the foundation, and you get to the foundation via a RESTful API call, and WHO give you the API key so you can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling, so first of all, a good question. This is this thing we get asked a lot. I did at some point, because the Docker image that they publish, I think, is the same as the API. And if you have entity IDs, you can call back and get some information about it.
Yeah.
But the thing for me is that I'm not convinced, I was never convinced or wasn't for sure that that was actually the entire foundation if I pulled all of it. We did do a kind of transitive closure on the whole thing. But also without having a sort of definitive published version of it, I wasn't confident that we would be working with something that was actually representative of what it should have been or whatever. But I do, just to answer your question, I mean, I think largely it would have helped in areas around the sort of other unspecified things. But in general, when it comes to the sort of specified codes, there's an awful lot that's already there. But we should talk, because I didn't see anything about other information beyond just the parents and children and the basic names in what I was seeing.
The definitions there in the foundation. But I can show you briefly a demo on my web server.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Very, very interesting. I know you've probably dealt with this in your SNOMED ICD10 map, but I'm wondering if there's any indication in your mapping on the strength of the mapping in terms of equivalence or broader than representation, because the semantics of the textual things are different between SNOMED and ICD because of their exclusion criteria. I'm wondering if you handled that at all.
Well, I mean, equivalence is, there's very few things that are equivalent because the, granularity differences mean that maybe some higher level thing in SNOMED is equivalent. And I mean, it wasn't something we specifically sort of output, but it would be possible to say, I mean, certainly the strength of the match is part of the answer to that. Like, how close are these things to being equal? But with language variations and things like that, it's a little hard too. But I do think that in most of the cases, SNOMED is just narrower, right? Because
in many cases, it's broader. If you have a term in the MMS that has exclusions, then it's not included in the normal taxonomic inheritance that would be included in the SNOMED meaning. So it's really an interpretation of what you mean.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean, the exclusion stuff is really handled mostly as a lexical thing, not as a hierarchy representation. So if the exclusion was inclusive of the thing on the SNOMED side, then that would be a filtering opportunity, right? But more based on that than saying, is this whole category subtree of SNOMED, let's say, to be excluded from this code because of the exclusions? Yeah. I mean, that's probably something you could do a little better, but I'm not sure how widespread a difference that would make.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Stephanie Weber from the German NRC. You might have heard in the Open General Assembly about the ideas of SNOMED and ICD11 to get closer together. How do you think your work could influence that? Where would you see that could be useful for this endeavor we're emerging into?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think there's two possible answers to that I would give. One is certainly any sorts of agreements that make it easier to share all of this with the community and publish it in a way that we can solicit the wisdom of the crowd to provide feedback, because there's a lot of things to look through, and then just kind of tune what's happening. That would go a long way, of course. But then also I feel like, you know, it's this fairly opaque process. You're talking about getting access to the foundation, but I would love to just have a published file that is definitive and official, because then we could actually say, you know what I mean, that we could do something with that. And so any kind of agreement that gets towards that and exposes more of the kind of concept definition stuff and whatever explicitly would be very helpful. Yeah. And I hope that happens. I would love for that.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Thank you.